rising in every bombed out home, in the schoolrooms, in the prisons, in the markets it has grown. Unleashed now like a pit bull with the teeth of diamond blades, the anger of a mother standing by her child's grave. It started as a protest, streams a billion fallen tears. Now the bucket's overflowing with the rage of 40 years of tyranny, dictatorship, and wars from every side. The poverty that power brings when empires collide.
Hello, welcome to my video. This is Socialist Links. As the title of the video suggests, this is mostly a video that's going to be covering identity politics and class politics, and how both actually coincide with each other to the actual root problems of society in the capitalist mode of production, and how both political structures end up basically creating a lot of the capitalist exploitation that we face under today. The reason why I think this is a very important video to make is due to the rise of left-wing anti-identity politics, and the rise of it trying to basically create a sort of class reductionist and class-based oriented analysis without analyzing the trying to degrading or downplaying the importance of identity struggle and not just the class struggle that faces under society. There are many of these views and many tendencies that basically express this idea of left-wing anti-identity politics, such as, for example, Maoist and self-declared neo-socialist Paul Cockshott, that is very famous for his degrading and downplaying of transgender oppression that faces in society today, and saying that the LGBTQIA+ community is a community that is completely degrading and trying to downplay the struggle of classes that transgender and gay and homosexuals face all the time, and not apparently analyzing that there are bourgeois homosexuals and transgenders in society, and thus basically saying that trying to basically advocate for freedom for LGBTQIA+ communities is entirely liberal, because of the fact that we are advocating for the freedom of those people and not the freedom of generally the proletariat. This basically coincides with a apparently reactionary view by a supposed idea of progression, and it completely distorts the ideas of Marxism, where Marx even says in the economic philosophical manuscripts that socialism is to be the emancipation of humanity, not just the emancipation of the proletariat. But it's not just these Maoists and self-declared neo-socialists. These ideas have actually been conveying with many Orthodox Trotskyist organizations, or a Orthodox Trotskyist organization. Most recent one, but not limited to, The Politics of Division, Marxism versus Identity Politics by Ylva Windberg, who is a member, a part of the International Marxist Tendency, that published this during the Marxist University session of videos and sessions entirely around this point. There's also other works that basically degrade identity politics, such as articles a part of the World Socialist website, a mainly Orthodox Trotskyist and Heliest organization that mostly even critiques a lot of, identity politics. In fact, there's an entire section in the website that is based off identity politics and a critique against it. What really struck out to me the most entirely, which actually started to understand how bad it is to basically make a point about this and make a point actually in defense of identity politics and understanding a dialectical analysis between class struggle and identity struggle, is when the second Australian branch of the International Socialist Tendency ended up having one of their members make an article that has ended up gaining traction in a large majority within the Australian branch of the International Socialist Tendency. If you do not know, the IST, International Socialist Tendency, is the organization I'm mostly affiliated with and I'm mostly organized with as well. And this has honestly been fear. I am, of course, talking about the recent article that Sarah Granham made, the quote, "The Failure of Identity Politics, a Marxist Analysis" by Sarah Garnham, and ended up making a podcast with the Red Flag Radio podcast, promoting or basically conveying those same ideas within a episode, a part of it. So as we see, this idea of left-wing anti-identity politics is very much prevalent within a lot of tendencies. It's even prevalent within neo-Trotskyist ideas and neo-Trotskyist organizations. And the neo-Trotskyist international organization, the International Socialist Tendency. So if we understand that this is a very prevalent idea, what is so wrong about it? Well, this is what the video tries to basically convey based on my own interpretations of identity politics and basically understanding the significance of class struggle and where the class struggle even comes from in the first place and how the class struggle arises in the first place as well. This video is going to try to respond into certain individual characters within each article I mentioned and with each book I mentioned and even the author I mentioned as well, Paul Cockshott. But the main thing here is not necessarily a response to these authors. The main point here is basically the message I'm trying to convey here, that there is a dialectic between the class struggle and the identity struggle as well under capitalism, and especially under class societies in general. So without further ado, let's get started in the actual video itself. First off, let's get some basic introductions into some facts about race and identity, and as well as the fact even gender and sex itself. It's been anthropologically proven, although not conveyed enough, that race and gender itself is entirely based off a social construct that mostly has been emerged through class societies that have, or actually due to the emergence of class societies at the same time, as a way to objectify people to the rank of a slave or to a rank of a lower person compared to a slaver themselves. The same happened with women and the same and also gender expression when they cited that more feminine traits, such as mostly the personality traits that was associated more to the biological sex of a female, was basically introduced was actually a physical trait that basically said that apparently these personality traits shows that this person is somewhat breedable and is made to essentially be able to provide sexual pleasure for people in society, and only that. And while with people that were male, that had more masculine traits, essentially had to basically do the hard labor and had to do all the hard work, and were the ones that were running the traits of society entirely. And this is where the ideas of gender and race come from. The association of blacks or Ethiopians versus the Egyptians and possibly even the Romans, that of their skin color, was mostly associated based off the idea that these skin color somehow showed that that some humans were better than others, rather than understanding that these skin colors existed due to the certain conditions that they were faced at the time, with these certain material conditions that they were basically evolved under as well. It's even been proven through anthropology by Louis Henry Morgan and another anthropologist that is actually very well researched on this, Chris Harman, and other anthropological studies that have been able to find that skin color has mostly been based actually not necessarily a genetical trait that others have, but rather actually the skin color being a response to UV rays from previous evolutionary evolvement of ancestors with the given conditions. to convey this in a very more simple way that someone can understand, if my ancestors were basically from Africa, my skin color is going to be black. The reason why is because there is more UV waves that are exposed there, and it's a lot more hotter there. While if my ancestors were from Iceland or so, my skin color is going to be more white, because it's a lot colder there. There's less sun exposure, and there's not gonna and there's not really much to actually protect yourself from the heat, but rather protect yourself from the cold. If my ancestors were from the Mediterranean, my skin color is going to be very much tan in a way. So that way, it's not really that hot, but it is hot enough to the point where there is some adaptations that need to be made for the humans to survive. If my ancestors were from Asia, my eyes are going to be very small, or going to be very smaller compared to other people, because so that way I can protect myself from massive amounts of dust storms in the areas. If my skin color was mostly if my skin color was mostly brown, and my ancestors were from the Middle East or so, or India, my skin color is going to just be brown in general. It's going to be dark, but not too dark as compared to people from Africa, because there's not as much UV exposure as there is in Central Africa and Southern Africa. However, there is enough exposure and enough dryness and heat to the point where there needs to be a skin adaptation in order to deal with the exposure of the sun and how the environment is structured. To the point where basically the idea of race is not an actual genetical thing that can actually be researched based off genetical analysis, but rather is something that actually has happened, and something that usually happens through historical adaptations that humans have made. Which makes sense because humans entirely, throughout species of humanity, has always been an adaptation. We historically have adapt to other things, based even on our own abilities to basically change ourselves. That's what defines our species compared to other species on Earth. And with women, or the idea of gender itself, with more feminine traits and masculine traits, the systems of consanguinity of all forms of a family have basically been mentioned to differ those today. Basically, there was basically the idea that a child, basically with its given gender role and its given personality traits, had to fit some form of narrative. A child was basically then raised to somehow hunt and or possibly work in the fields of houses during the Neolithic revolution, from the transition from slavery to class societies of slavery. And how this was basically structured was mostly based off children basically being conditioned and taught that these ideas essentially about gender and about work ethics among certain personality traits based on femininity or masculinity that was basically proposed at the time was basically fit a certain character for these people, and that people with more feminine traits had to basically subside to other ideas, and had to subside to actually taking care of the household, actually having to take care of the children, having to raise them, and also having to basically be a sexual pleasurer for the men of society. These masculine and feminine traits mainly emerge as a way to basically distinct humans, and to basically create the idea that humans essentially had a natural role in society, rather than humans themselves choosing what they essentially desire to do in society. And that was one of the major things that basically was different compared from what we understand as pre-class societies in tribalism, where people were not necessarily chose what they wanted to do, but there was no class emergence and there was no hierarchy, due to the fact that people had to take care of each other and people had to collectivize to each other in order to survive in society. Thus, basically, was a limit yet was a freedom, compared to slavery, or the transition, the Neolithic revolution, where the emergence of agriculture basically completely transitioned the economical structures to where it basically produced a hierarchical structure, where the owners of farms would try to basically have people that were apparently undesirable and impure to basically work on the farms, and work on the agricultural fields in order to provide them food and water, etc. that was kind of the major things. This gave rise to the slavers and the slave classes. There's not necessarily a taxation format with already the state in place, because the state only emerged mostly as a way to against later on, after the fact, after slavery, in the way of how basically food was taken from lower classes in feudalism. But in slavery, this wasn't the case. This was mostly basically done through slavers. Now, did racism emerge because of class societies? No. In fact, the idea of race itself actually emerged before slavery entirely. The thing is, though, is that why it's important to understand that, and why they are connected, is because these ideas about race and sexual freedom, or sexual obedience, was mostly a way to basically be able to create the preconception and the entire conception that creates a logical conclusion, or creates some form of conclusion, to where slavery is somehow an actual fact, because black people apparently were just naturally obedient. Now, is this true? Absolutely not. As we just found out, your skin color and a lot of the facial features and a lot of the physical features you have both inside your brain, in the skull, and in your skin color and your physical traits entirely is based on the certain environment that you're in which it allows you to survive. And that's how humans have essentially evolved over time. We didn't necessarily have to evolve into that certain structure, though, because we as humans been able to live a more comfortable life without basically having to evolve in that certain structure. But in times where we were hunter and gatherers, and we were still at the time at the bottom of the food chain, that was very much important for us to survive, for us to basically adapt, and for us to basically grow to the point where we are in today, and to grow to the point where we are now top of the food chain. But because of the entire ideas of gender and race, a lot of the freedoms, both among certain ethnicities and also certain people and other people as well, such as sexual freedom and equal representation, was completely destructed. Sexual freedom was entirely suppressed, and more sexual partners were basically provided to others. The ethnicity people that were basically grouped with certain ethnicities for one day ended up the next day being kidnapped and taken to a plantation mostly owned by a Mesopotamian slaver at the time. And that's kind of like the major things that happened, or possibly a Roman slaver as well. And people in the Greek states that were somehow citizens and naturally born, citizens in one state, ended up basically being declared as an object or property the next day. And this was kind of very, transformative, and basically created the entire hierarchy that we live under today. There was rebellions that essentially ensued after this and after the fact, but they didn't really have enough power because no one expected this to happen until the logic was basically then presented together and people just accepted it, which is really bad. And this gave rise to the state. With the rebellions that basically ensued during this time period, the classes that were basically the hierarchical classes that were basically emerging at the time basically saw this as a threat to their order, and they basically sought that there needed to be a knightree or possibly a force in order to basically protect them. And this is where the state came in. And in that aspect, the state emerged through the social divisions that we as humanity face based on our social relations to the means of production, and how these social relations are antagonistic. The slaver and the slave have completely different interests at hand. The slaver seeks to use the slave into their own benefit, while the slave seeks to be free and basically use their labor and be able to express themselves entirely. While the slaver already has that position, already has that freedom, to them, for the slave to basically express themselves completely destroys their ability to express themselves and their ability for who they are at that moment as well. And with that basically gave rise with the idea that that in order to fight against each other, in order to basically prevent each other's demise, there had to be some form of depravity of a certain class interest. And as we understand the use of the force of the state, how this was basically formed in ancient Egypt, in ancient Rome, and the Greek states, this is mainly focused to try to basically keep the slaves in line, to try to keep the new slaves that were emerged at this time in line, and to not rebel against the new order at hand. Now, did slaves listen? Yes, they actually did for a certain amount of time, until they realized that they couldn't live longer like this, and so they ended up fighting against this. This entire idea, in fact, as a conception and a general pattern, is even conceptualized by by German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel as the master-slave dialectic. I'll try to explain the master-slave dialectic pretty shortly, but this is basically the general idea of it. The master holds the slave in their possession, and they don't exactly see eye to eye to them. They have a conflicting interest. However, the master still needs the slave to work to provide for society, but he cannot let him be equals because his living is based off enslavement towards others. Meanwhile, the slave, he is still human. He still has consciousness. He wants to live his life. He performs work for his master, and what does he get? Well, actually quite a lot. He still gets food, water, housing, and medicine. So there is a benefit, but he never chose he never get to choose if he wanted it. He never got to be the same level as the master when it comes to social and economic mobility. Yet he still works hard, and sure, maybe the master but the master still benefits from the slave's labor, and the benefits the slave gets is one decided by the master. See, without the slave, there is no master, and without the master, there is no slave. Despite the fact that they both hate each other, and one has to have the other exist, despite the massive it's still a massive difference. But ultimately, it comes down to where the master needs the slave, but the slave doesn't need the master, to where the slave rises up against the master. And that's basically how slavery in Europe was mostly abolished during this time period. Was the slaves realizing that they could just get the food and water that they were provided from the slaver if they just killed the slaver and just took it for themselves. And that's exactly what happened during the transformation around this period. But one thing that we have to understand about this basic fact entirely, which is going to be the main premise here, is that the identity and the class that basically emerged did not essentially emerge one without the other. There was no class first and then identity, nor was there identity first and then classes. It was all connected to each other, and both at some point were able to exist and be able to emerge in a certain way together in a constantly changing format, with different qualities at hand, with contradictions in quality, yet able to function in unison, despite the contradictions. That's the dialectic here. Without there necessarily being class, there is no identity, and without this being the identity struggle, there is no class struggle as well. And that's the thing here that we have to understand. And to basically convey this, if there was no ability for us to understand the economic hardships of black people in the United States, there would be no Black Lives Matter. There would be no massive movement that we understand on the oppression that black people face. And without basically the ideas of black people entirely being compared to more wealthy white people, there would essentially be no ability to understand a certain oppression that a certain minority in society may face compared to another ethnicity or compared to another people at point. And there could possibly be no comparisons between the difference on the working class between blacks and the working class between whites. Not saying that they all are different, but that we understand that there is a majority of the working class mostly being black and Hispanic, and the working class today as well also still not really conveying much white people compared to previous times beforehand. they are all connected to each other. They are all in some form of way constantly changing with each other at hand in each given format. So that's the introduction of the basic rights. So what do we understand about, the emergence of classes and identity? Well, I just basically explained it. There is no identity without class, and there is no class without identity. That's the thing. You cannot basically analyze the difference between a Hispanic or possibly a person from Latin America that's coming into the United States trying to look for a job and something to do, and then an idea entirely, and then basically a position at hand. With immigration policies to basically try and suppress the emergence of immigrants basically coming into the United States through massive amounts of border security basically being merged, mostly due to a lot of, racist ideas that somehow these Latin American immigrants that were coming into the United States were stealing jobs from more white workers. There wouldn't be a class struggle between a majority of a nationalistic bourgeoisie in America versus a proletarian population in Latin America if there was no entire idea between a Latin American and a North American or general European American, Anglo-American, basically. Man, I really am sick. Holy shit! Oh, God. Anyways, the point is that there would be no essential idea of protectionism without some form of basically bad guy scenario based off the idea of identity in order to enhance a class struggle and even have a certain class fight against each other, thus creating infighting of classes, a proletariat population fighting against itself. It creates an idea of a certain bad guy scenario of a certain race or that is associated with somehow an action that they're providing, and basically then essentially trying to have others fight against it through actions of discrimination against that identity through the emergence of a class that seeks to basically benefit itself to try and have less workers to basically employ, so that way they can be able to produce more profit without basically having to pay much workers to produce commodities, and could just do so with the increasement of automation, and not trying to basically focus that bad guy scenario on them, but mostly focus that on other workers, for other workers to fight against other workers. But this wouldn't happen if there was no such thing as the identity between a Hispanic versus a majority white Nordic person. So what does this have to do with the criticisms that these people basically provided? Well, quite a lot. For example, in Paul Cockshot's book Towards a New Socialism, Paul Cockshott tries to argue the fact that basically there's this idea that transgender people, have basically been dividing the entire ways of how class struggle is able to emerge and how class struggle is able to basically produce itself, and that it's not analysis in the root problems of society, which is class struggle. But here's the thing: the root problems at hand is not class struggle at all. Class struggle itself is a social relations to the means of production. The means of production based off the mode of production on how things are produced entirely in the first place. And as we've seen with race and identity, and gender itself is also emerged with the ideas and with the structures on how the mode of production is able to benefit itself as well. And this is one of the major things we have to understand. If you guys need to basically look more into this, I recommend my video, Black Struggle and Capitalism, which you can basically also look into as well if you need to as well. So yeah, that's basically one of the major things here. And if we understand that this is a kind of like a thing that both identity struggle and class struggle is basically emergence, then transgender people are not trying to deviate from class struggle at all. In fact, they are also suffering from the conditions of capitalism. Transgender people are more likely to be unemployed than a cisgendered person. They are 9 out of 10 transgender people in a room have faced harassment for them being transgender before. there's many amounts of transphobic media out there that's basically that's basically made gender norms for certain people. Hell, and even the idea that there is some form of transgender, that basically someone that could be transgender could just switch their class and not switch their class, switch their personality traits based on feminine and masculine traits, is in itself still based off the idea of gender, to where it basically creates some form of idea that masculine and feminine traits should define who you are, and not just your individual interests and entire individual characters at hand that you desire to be yourself. If you want, and that's one of the major things actually about communism, what we understand about the abolition of gender. There should not be the idea of gender in the first place, for the fact that it basically objectifies the human being to the point of certain masculine and feminine traits that does not define them as their actual individuality. If one wants to adopt feminine and masculine traits, that is fine. However, that shouldn't be based off basically an idea of what that basically is supposed to mean and what they're basically defined by. And they don't, and thus they don't have to be defined by binary structures. They can entirely be just a general human being, and not essentially be subjected to the idea of gender entirely, and thus just an individual human being. Thus, maybe this word gender will not be abolished, but as we conceptualize as gender today and how it's always been throughout history of class societies, it will completely change when we understand that the only solution in society, when we understand about a lot of these oppressions, is the abolition of classes entirely. The complete negation of money as well, and the complete negation of the state in socialism and communism. This is one of the major things that also Paul Kochler doesn't understand. The structures at hand of what makes classes emerge in the first place is not based off just class struggle, that there is some form of class that just somehow emerged. No, it's the fact that there is a production process at hand that allowed this class to emerge and basically saw usefulness for this production process. A bourgeois did not become a bourgeois because he wanted to. If there was essentially no way for there to be mass production, for there to be some form of generalization of the market entirely, there wouldn't be some form of method in which it could basically produce as much commodities as possible for the cheapest price possible and the fastest way possible, without someone having the idea to just employ people to work for them and be able to sell the commodities that they produce in order to sell that into the market, because the person that basically is employed sells their labor power itself, which is already acting as a commodity, and thus quote unquote voluntary structures thus quote unquote voluntary exchange would then create a class emergence and a hierarchical structure through economic fields, and thus relies on different methods at hand to be able to structure this in a different way. Again, a dialectic between identity and class emerges then, because class and identity itself would then be based off the mode of production of each given society, and thus with the mode of production of each given society either objectifies the human being in some far way, or in some far way completely negates it. And so far as what we've seen from the emergence of recent human history, it's only made to objectify and alienate the human being. I would like to quote Paul Kochler to provide proof about his arguments here in his book, Towards a New Socialism. However, I'm not able to actually provide that. But what I can provide is an argument that has mostly actually been similar argued by Yuval Windberg, a part of the International Marxist Tendency, in her recent video about it. And here we are going to watch it. So bear with me, fellas. Before we get started, though, I would like to preface before we start actually citing this, is that there are going to be log pauses in the video. The reason why is because the platform was streamed into multiple different countries with multiple languages, so they basically had to pause each time point so that way translations could basically emerge for both Spanish, French, Polish, German, Swedish, Pakistani, Hindu, Arabic, and a bunch of other languages that basically the IMT ended up translating for many of its international viewers.
Capitalists and politicians pit different sectors of the masses against each other. So that workers see each other as the enemy instead of the capitalists and the capitalist system itself. And we see this today, how reactionary politicians like Trump, Bolsonaro, and Boris Johnson try to rally a part of the most politically backward sectors of the masses against trans people, women's right to abortion, immigrants, to keep workers from uniting. To keep them from struggling against capitalism. Oppression is also very profitable for the capitalists. Immigrants and other parts of the working class are paid less, and that puts a pressure on the other more well-paid parts of the working class. To lower their wages and accept reduced working conditions. In order to not be replaced. By lowering wages for one sector of the working class, the capitalists can therefore lower the wages for all workers. Now, the way to fight oppression, we say, is through class unity. The stronger the unity of the working classes, then the harder it is to use oppression to divide the workers. And the more support a movement against oppression has among the broader layers of the working class, and the more the working class takes an active role in leading that struggle, and the more that that movement threatens the very system, the more gains can be won. This is because of the working class position in capitalist production.
As we understand, Yvel Winberg is kind of given this exact kind of the same argument here as Paul Cockshott did. However, the difference here is that she's not trying to say that then transgender people or that or that these people alone trying to convey this oppression alone is destroying the class struggle. She's mostly arguing that basically we need to understand that just because a transgender person and a cisgender person are completely different when it comes to the hierarchical and privileges that they basically face, or for transgender people, the lack thereof privileges, does not mean that then these unifications among cisgender and transgender people cannot come to basically fight against the root systems of what causes these problems entirely. To which I agree, but the thing is that it's based off the idea and based off an argument that suggests that transgender people and that the transgender oppression that is basically being faced is less important than the class struggle at hand that is facing in capitalism. But in reality, it's not. And the same goes for women's oppression as well. And also with identity and just general identity. The general identity struggle is less important than the class struggle at hand, which I disagree with. They are both important, and they both have their entire own contributions that basically provide different amounts of structures of how capitalism is based. The best example of such idea of such thing would actually be the Treaty of the Mexican-American War. When California was first proposed to the United States of America from the conclusions, the resolutions of the Mexican-American War, Baja California was also provided as a structure in which it could also belong to the state of California as well. However, this was rejected from the United States, and they seceded, and they conceded for it to belong to Mexico as apparently a gift. Now, you could probably guess the real reason why they just refused to basically take Baja California. If your guess is that despite the fact that they would have gotten more private property and more capital accumulation, they did not want the land due to the amount of more brown-skinned Hispanics in the area, then you are correct. You see, America and the bourgeoisie in the United States of America could have profited way more if they had bought Baja California. There's a lot more workers there, there's a lot more population there as well, and there was a lot of available land that could essentially be produced and could be able to expand the corn production fields and also the production and also industrialization in the United States if they were to have gotten Baja California and bought private property in those areas in order to employ more and more workers there. But they didn't, because of a racist idea that somehow Hispanics were just completely undesirable to the ways of living and to the American ways of life. And they opted to basically only take in Hispanics and lands where mostly white-skinned Hispanics really lived under at the time, which was lands mostly the New Mexico territory, California, and Colorado and Texas. By the way, to clarify, I'm not saying that Texas was gained from the Mexican-American War, but it was indeed gained due to Texas basically wanting to basically join up the Union, join the United States of America, and Mexico not really liking that idea, which ended up causing the Mexican-American War in the first place too. And thus Mexico lost its lands. And they did offer another piece of land for them that they could have gotten, but they did not because the ethnic population of that land for them was undesirable for them, despite the fact it would have been more profitable if they had it, and they would have made a lot more capital accumulation and thus being able to produce a lot more commodities and also be able to make more profit that way if they were to have bought that land, but they didn't. Now, does this debunk the point that Yuva Vinberg is basically giving in the extract that I provided? No, it's not. Her point is not that basically that some oppression at some point, that there is no such thing as identity struggle. In fact, she cited struggles of identity that has happened before. Her main point at hand in the conclusion is not that we need to basically degrade transgender people or the struggles that women and other identity groups are facing, but that these struggles alone is not the problem at hand. There's also a bigger struggle, or a struggle at hand, that happens through the capitalist mode of production, that is class struggle. Now, what does then this mean? Okay, well, here's the thing. it's not a bigger struggle. It's just a different struggle with a different quality. That's the thing. And not only that, but you don't have to basically have some form of identity struggle just to basically make it more profitable for capitalists. Capitalists have made decisions, racist and sexist decisions, despite the fact it would have been less profitable for them anyways. So that way they just don't have to deal with that certain racial group because of the entire ideas and because of the massive amounts of discriminatory thoughts and actions that end up basically hurting these people. Racism itself, it can act as a prejudice, but can also act as discrimination, both directly and indirectly. But in this case, for the purchase of Baja California, it was mostly direct. But but for the oppression that Black people face, where they are more likely to be shot down and to be arrested by a cop than a white person for nonviolent crimes, that is a format of indirect racism. It's still racist and discriminatory action regardless, though, and it performs the exact same function, rather direct or indirect. And as we understand about the struggles that classes face, workers are having to sell their labor power in order to survive in an indirect coercion, an indirect action that in a way discriminates them because of the fact that they are in a society where they are so dependent to the market, where they have to basically buy food and buy a lot of the stuff that they get through the use of exchanging money for commodities. And the only ways they could basically get that money is if they were to sell their labor power for a certain amount of time and only get that amount of money at the end of the workday, at the end of the amount of hours that they provided, in order to basically get the commodities that they need, such as food, water, shelter, medicine, electricity, and other technological advancements and other things that humans need today in order for us to survive in our current society. To the point where workers end up basically barely scraping by, but they still voluntarily work because society conditions them to quote unquote voluntarily work. But is it voluntary? It still is. I guess they're choosing to work that amount of hours. They are choosing to get the job, yes. But that misses the point on how this choice is so narrow and the path is so small, and there's only really two choices at hand in which they could actually perform it. And that's the thing. That's also an indirect action. So what does this mean? This doesn't mean that then class struggle is more important than identity struggle, nor the opposite. It means at hand that both have their different qualities at hand and also have similarities in which this is acted. That is rooted in the capitalist mode of production itself that conditions society into working in this structural way. Thus, is there one reason why a women's abortion is denied mostly, or is there multiple reasons? The reason could be that, yeah, there's more workers, there's a more worker population to basically employ, and there's more workers for them to basically infight with each other in order to basically get jobs, and thus basically lowers the prices of the labor power for the proletariat. But there's also another reason in which it basically comes with an sexist idea that women are only made to produce babies, and that if they were to basically get rid of, the cellular structures of a fetus, then that they are going against their role into society, what they are apparently genetically made to do. There's that reason, and there's also another reason to where people are just simply reactionary and they don't understand, science, and they don't understand the basic science about a fetus, or they're very religious and they are basically alienated to humanity, from humanity, and basically only have more faith into an abstract God that may or may not exist. And based on even conception alone cannot exist based on just conception alone, and also and thus basically have that entire notion, have more faith into just that God instead of just general humanity. Having faith into a God to basically make decisions over humans, basically what's better for them, rather than trusting the human of what they want and the human understanding basic interests and common interests for other humans of what they desire as well. This goes into religion, by the way. I haven't made a YouTube video about this, but yeah, basically the point is that religion basically abstracts us away from the importance of humans, and human action that has basically changed the world, and mostly abstracts that to some form of omnipotent God. Anyways, to get back to identity politics, this is one of the major things that happened during this period. In fact, women's oppression ended up emerging before class society emerged. There had to be the idea that there basically had to be certain gender traits and certain personality traits for women and for and people with feminine characters, to basically be, well, just objectified as sex animals, rather than before there could be any form of way to where women were actually acted as sex slaves, rather that there was an idea at hand that the sex slave structure was implemented. But this idea was not actually acted until there was some form of material conditions to where it could allow it to be acted in the first place. And that is where slavery and the emergence of class societies came in. They're not less important with each other. Without basically the idea of without the structures of classes, sexual oppression wouldn't even exist as an action itself. But without the conception of sexual oppression, there would be no action. And that's what makes it a dialectic. It's not that it is less than the other, it is that both essentially have their different qualities at hand. And that's kind of the main thing that this video is basically arguing for, and why this is kind of a main deal. Now, to address another author, a part of the international socialist tendency, Sarah Garnham, in her work, The Failure of Identity Politics. The Failure of Identity Politics, a Marxist analysis. Quote-unquote Marxist, of course. In the work, The Failure of Identity Politics, a Marxist analysis by Sarah Garnham says, quote, intersectionality has become a core term in identity politics lexicon. It is the most often used in express political support for a range of oppressed groups simultaneously. Sometimes it is also to help as a method of social analysis. The overarching conception of intersectionality is that there is multiple forms of oppression in society, that they are interconnected like traffic in an intersection, coming and going at all directions, as Kimberly Crenshaw put in her 1989 essay that coined the term. Since it was coined as a term, intersectionality has been tied to retrospectively to black feminism, and specifically to the critique of radical black feminists made of mainstream second-wave feminists, in arguing that both race and class were important to understanding women's oppression. For this reason, intersectionality is often presented as an alternative to conservative single-issue variants of identity politics, but in reality, intersectionality exists within the framework of identity politics, and it arose as a conception not within radical movements, but rather within the legal academy as a means to codify legal precedents. For Crenshaw, intersectionality was a way to overcome the lacuna in anti-discrimination law at the time, which could not account for the fact that black women are affected not just by racism or by sexism, but experience a specific kind of discrimination because of their multiple oppressions. This legalistic origin demonstrates the intersectionality is neither theoretically nor politically based on the fight to overthrow oppression. It is limited to describing personal experience and finding resources for individuals within the system. End quote. Sarah Garnham, The Failure of Identity Politics, a Marxist analysis. So there's quite a lot to address here. First off, in Kimberly Crenshaw's work, there's no actual argument that says that the second wave feminists during the time period that argued for both a class oppression and identity oppression essentially was structured. In fact, Kimberly Crenshaw allowed class struggle into her intersectional analysis. In fact, she argued that it was an economic intersection that was basically emerged in her 1989 essay. To provide evidence, I could try to cite the source right now. In her 1989 essay, Kimberly Crenshaw even says, quote, "Moore illustrates one of the limitations of anti-discrimination laws, remember the scope of the normative vision, the refusal to allow multiply disadvantaged class to represent other who may have been singularly disadvantaged, defeats efforts and to restructure the distribution of opportunity and limits the remedial the relief to minor adjustments within an established hierarchy. Consequently, bottom-up approaches, those which combine all discriminates in order to challenge an entire employment system, are focused based on the limited view of the wrong and narrow scope of available metamy. If such bottom-up intersectional representation were routinely permitted, employees might accept the possibility that they are more to gain by collectively challenging the hierarchy, rather than each discriminate individually seeking to protect her source of privilege within the hierarchy." End quote. Kimberly Crenshaw, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. Jeez, that's a fucking title. Jeez, that's a fucking mouthful of a title, man. Holy shit. So, as we read from Kimberly Crenshaw herself, is what Sarah Granham said true? Well, it is true that there is a intersectional that there is oppression that works as an intersection for each different group that basically is related to each other, a part of the same road. Yeah, that is indeed true. But does this then mean that then apparently class intersectionality does not exist? No. In fact, in her work, she specifically cites that not only is the employment system, as in the capitalist system, basically provide a lot of this problem, but that if the employees were to unite and work together, that this could actually be able to be stopped. So the idea that this intersectional analysis is not able to be able to provide working class unity is false, because from the considered founder of the intersectional theories herself, this is actually a great way to stop intersectional oppression, to stop the intersectional oppression that usually faces in society today. Now, is there entire identity essentialists and identity reductionists? Yes, there is. They've existed for a long time. In fact, it's one very prominent within liberal movements, and also even the DSA, which is a social democratic organization in the United States that seeks to basically strain away from Marxism. It is the idea that identity itself is the main problems of society rather than class struggle. But that's not what Kimberly Crenshaw is arguing here. She's actually arguing that workers should unite and that there is also intersectional oppression that faces classes. And this is one of the major things today. And that's the thing about identity politics. It's not just an either-or thing. It's not just an entire liberal thing. It's a general thing that could basically be analyzed in a Marxist view, and actually has been analyzed in a Marxist view as well. In a way where it could be able to provide better conclusions and better alternatives for workers to unite. An example of it being able to provide for a Marxist analysis, I will provide this. In a work from a very intellectually based comrade, a part of the International Socialist Tendency, in the British section of the International Socialist Tendency, Alice Kalinikos says in his great work, Race and Class, quote, "Racism thus gives the white workers a particular identity, one moreover which unites them by white capitalists. We have here the case of a kind of imagined community discussed by Benedict Anderson in his influential analysis of nationalism. The nation, he argues, is an imagined political community, in particular regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each. The nation is always conceived and deep horizontal comradeship. Anderson, however, stresses that he sees the difference between nationalism and racism. The fact that on the matter he writes that nationalism thinks in terms of historical destinies, while racism dreams of internal containmentships, transmitted from the origins of time through an endless sequence of loathsome populations outside history. It is undoubtedly true that, as we have seen, racist ideology conceives race, or more recently, ethnicity, as incapable fate. Nevertheless, Anderson's argument fails to take into account the way in which recent decades the idea of the national culture has become one of the main reasons used to justify, for example, tightening up immigration controls, Consider Thatcher's infamous appeal to those afraid of being swamped by people with a different culture discussed above. End quote, as Kalinikos, Race and Class. Even previously, before he said that, he also says, quote, this contrast between the formal equality and the real inequality of capitalist and worker is a fundamental feature of bourgeois society, reflected in many aspects of its development. The great bourgeois revolutions, which swept away with the obstacles of the dominance of the capitalist mode of production, mobilized the masses under the banner of freedom and equality. The poorest he, that is England, has to live as the greatest he, and therefore every man that is to live under a government ought to first by his own consent to put himself under that government, said Colonel Ransborough in the Punity debates of 1647. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with the certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American Declaration of Independence of 1776 proclaims, and the great French Revolution of 1789 was waged under the banner of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And yet the paradox that was capitalism, whose domination involves the exploitation of free wage labor, benefited immensely from a critical phase and development from colonial slavery. This relationship continued well into the era of the Industrial Revolution, and the textile factories, whose hard land, northern England, imported the main raw material from the slave plantations of the American South. Capitalism's reliance on slave labor became an anomaly requiring explanation. It was in this context that the idea that blacks were subhuman and therefore did not demand the equal respect increasingly acknowledged as the right of human beings began to take hold. End quote, as Kalinikos, Race and Class. As we can see here, there can indeed be analysis, and there always has been an analysis in which there is actually a way where race and class struggle actually ends up relating to each other and is actually transformed in a way due to the given capitalist mode of production that has transformed it in a way where it's taken into a certain oppression that oppresses black people, women, and disabled people, and various other people around the world, and also the general working class entirely. That's the main argument here, and by doing this, we are able to unite with each other and continue on the revolution that the bourgeois revolutions that brought about capitalism failed to do. That is the abolition of classes entirely, and the abolition of money, and the state entirely. So that way, we can progress into a better society, where the free association of labor is generalized into a huge extent, where humans are able to express themselves based on their own human expression and their desires alone. In the end of her work, the failure of identity politics and Marxist analysis, she even ends up saying, identity politics is a dead end for the oppressed and anyone looking to seriously challenge injustice. Marxism offers an alternative. As a theory, it is based upon understanding the society as a unified contradictory totality. This means that it can be used to explain the complexity and variability of different forms of oppression, while recognizing that each exists within and because of the dominion of one social class by another. These social relations point to where power lies and how it might be challenged to the material basis of oppression done away with. Now, I do agree that Marxist analysis does indeed provide a totality of analysis through the means of class struggle, but that's not the only means that it basically produces. In fact, there's actually other evidence in other works even then where Marx actually cites identity as a factor. Example would actually be the Holy Family would actually be chapter 6, section 3, a part of the Holy Family, where Marx specifically is arguing that identity of the Jewish people and identity for ethnicities all around Europe and all around the world go through some form of certain oppression that is driven by the capitalist mode of production. To basically quote, I will quote Karl Marx himself. Here, Karl Marx says, quote, just as industrial activity is not abolished when the privileges of trade guilds and corporations are abolished, but on the contrary, the real industry begins only after the abolition of these privileges, just as ownership of the land is not abolished when privileged land ownership is abolished, but on the contrary begins the universal movement only with the abolition of privileges with the free division of free sale of land, just as trade is not abolished by the abolition of trade privileges, but finds its true realization in free trade, so religion develops in a practical universality only where there is no privileged religion. Take, for example, the North American states. The modern public system, the developed modern state, is not based as criticism thinks on a society of privileges, but on a society in which privileges have been abolished and dissolved on the developed civil society, in which the vital elements which were politically bound under the privileged system have been set free. Here, no privileged exclusivity stands in opposed to either any other exclusivity or to the public system. Free industry and free trade abolish privileged exclusivity and thereby the struggle between the privileged exclusivities. Karl Marx, The Holy Family. End quote. Karl Marx, The Holy Family. Here we can actually see that Karl Marx is able to actually analyze an identity idea and a structure analysis of identity and a theory of identity in his work to basically understand the oppression of capitalism. Hell, that was like the entire structures and the entire debate of the Jewish question at the time, was rather not if Jews as an ethnicity should be able to basically dominate the entire religious sector all over the world, or if there should be an emancipation of Jews based on Jews themselves taking power and mandating a Jewish idea and a theological and theocratic Jewish state into the minds of others and into the structures of society in order to emancipate Jews. Marx basically argues differently. He argues against that idea and basically says that there is an entire atheistic that you can indeed have an atheistic state, a secular state, yet still have tons of religion entirely by allowing freedom of religion to emerge. And this alone can allow the freedom of expression for Jews to emerge entirely. So Zara Gronholm is actually wrong into trying to say that basically going against identity politics is somehow not a Marxist analysis. It is. Marx himself incorporated it into his theories, and even into the international socialist tendency with many theorists, such as even Tony Cliff himself, the considered founder for the British section of the Neo-Trotskyist movement, has been able to use a lot of identity political analysis into the analysis in which we can understand our current oppression today with capitalism. None of this is limited by or limited to by a certain factor at all, and this can be able to structure itself in a way where basically capitalism can emerge not just by the struggles that basically workers and identity people basically face, like with each other differently, but that it is all related to each other and has different qualities to each other, to where it ends up functioning through the same way, yet allow it to be different and constantly change over time. And that is basically one of the major things that we have to understand, that the world constantly changes, that this oppression constantly changes as well, that the world itself is constantly changing. And that's the thing about what we have to understand about class struggle and identity struggle, is that it is a dialectical relation. It is a dialectical relation that we have to understand that there is necessarily no anti-id pole left, or at least there shouldn't be, nor should there ever be an anti-class struggle left at all. We have to understand the dialectic between class struggle and identity struggle. Hence the dialectic of class and identity. I will basically quote myself in what I said, the black struggle of capitalism. Workers of the world, black, unite. Black and white, all must fight. Workers of the world, unite. Remember my words in the black struggle and capitalism. Workers of the world, unite. Black and white, all must fight. So workers of the world unite. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked this video, hit the like button down below. I very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button as well. I would also very much appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for watching this video. It's kind of been a pretty long video. I understand. I try to make videos. I try to make my videos short now, but with the live overpopulation theory I published yesterday, but it seems that wasn't the case in this video.